Hola mi gente, MsMalcolmHughes here. Welcome back. Today we're going to do a book review. We're going to be reviewing Sula by the one and only Toni Morrison. And for those of you who are not aware, Sula is one of my all-time favorite books. I haven't read it in some years now, but revisiting it was truly a treat. So let's get into what it's about. Sula is essentially the story of two young women, Nell and Sula, and how they grow up. They grow up together, but they're also two very different individuals who take different paths in life. And everything else kind of centers around them. We have this town, the bottom, which is actually the top of a hill. So it's that play on understanding there. But they grew up in this town, and we learn about all these fascinating characters around them. But our central figure is what really roots us and carries the story throughout are Nell and Sula. I'll get into all the juicy details and what I think about the story. And just fair warning, this will be a true spoiler. If you haven't read the book, you might want to pause now. If you have, let's get into it and let's talk about it because I really want to talk about it. So one of the things I really love about the book and Toni Morrison in general is that she's so descriptive. Because she writes so well and has such a mastery of the English language, she's able to be descriptive in a way that really allows us to see everything graphically and as vividly as we need to. And she's able to write such robust characters that even if they're only around for a moment or just like a couple of scenes, I feel as if I know them so intimately that they add value and give us a fuller picture of everyone else in the story as well. And so early on, we don't really know what's going on. Everyone's just intrigued about what's happening with Shadrach. He's just coming back from, well, he's coming back from war. He's been out for a while. He's really confused, dealing with severe PTSD. And so we get to really explore and try to understand the world through him. And also we get the backstory a bit of like how this community engages with each other, what's significant and what it means. And that's so important as the story progresses and things eventually change. And so with that opening, it does add a really deep analysis of race relations. And what I like about it is that in the intro, Toni Morrison talks about how she originally wasn't going to include it. It was just going to open up with Shadrach. We weren't going to have that background analysis of the bottom, but it adds so much to the story later on. And it definitely changes the tone. Had she started with Shadrach, it would have been a heavier read off that. But giving us that background story, it's kind of lighter. We have the ability to laugh even though it's heavy. And so that carries us through the story as well when we have really traumatic and heavy moments. And so as the story progresses, we get all these cool characters, very interesting characters. Honestly, I think Toni Morrison does character development better than anyone else I've read. So we have Sula, but obviously when you're a human, it's not just you. You have your ancestors and you have the generations before you. So there's Sula Peace. Last name will be important for later in this description. There's Sula Peace, there's her mother, Hannah, and then there's also her grandmother, Eva. Eva is a very interesting character and she's very prominent in the story as well. And so you have these very independent women and that really shapes who Sula becomes. Though Sula and Nell are best friends and they're kind of like, they come together to make a whole. Separately, they're very different. Sula decides that she wants to go live a very independent life while Nell decides to stay and get married and live that life. But we'll come back to that a little later. And so at one point, there's a really heavy scene in which Eva kills her son by fire. One thing I said while reading this book, I had put a post over on Instagram. I was like, listen, I love Toni Morrison, but these scenes where she is killing children, like my soul cannot take it. And so that happens here. And it's hard because it's obviously during a period where crack is becoming heavily prevalent in the Black community and is heavily impacting that generation, like our parents' generation. I feel like a lot of our great-grandparents migrated north or just migrated during the Great Migration, and they were able to start lives and have some stability. And then I feel like our parents were the ones where a lot of us, it kind of went away due to drug addiction, and that's what we see here. So her son comes back just a different man, and it's so hard for her. He was supposed to have a different life, and it's just so hard for her to see. And so eventually she goes and she does, like, in a sense, comfort him, but she does douse him in kerosene and sets him on fire. And that becomes very indicative of who Eva is as a person, what she will and will not withstand. She's someone who definitely demands respect, but also this impacts everyone in the house, because she kind of has a boarding house. She has her family there, but then also others are there as well. So it really shapes the individuals in the house, even though no one really comments on it. And that becomes even sadder later when Hannah accidentally dies by fire, and Eva jumps out. Eva only has one leg, but she jumps out the window to try to save her daughter. It's all very, very traumatic. And Hannah dies. Eva is there bleeding out, but she notices Sula watching. Not from fear, but more of interest. And so again, that shapes Sula as well. Also, another, Sula accidentally kills a child early on in the story. And so all of this causes us to really think, who is Sula and who does she become? Who did she start out as? And also there's another key moment for Sula where her mother, she overhears her mother saying she doesn't really like her, she loves her. And so this also, all of this shapes who Sula will become as a woman, and this will be important later with her friendship with Nell. And it also becomes a question of, like, is Sula a double murderer, right? She killed the child accidentally. Does she kill her mother by just watching and not actually intervening? So though it seems like, in a sense, she is a watcher, she's also a doer. Or is it her lack of doing that causes all this catastrophe? Just questions to consider. And I think all of that really leads to a big reason why I love Toni Morrison. It's the complexity of the characters. I understand all of their motivations. I understand their pains. Even if I don't agree with them, I understand them. And I just think that's dynamic and phenomenal writing. So eventually, once Nell gets married to a man named Jude, this will be important later, on her wedding day, after it's all said and done, it was a big ordeal, she sees Sula heading down the road. All of this has already transpired, but Sula is, like, out and she's swinging her hips. It's very clear even from a distance that it's Sula. So it tells you of her character, right? Just a prominent figure. But then 10 years later, she shows up. A sword of crows come back with her. It's all very ominous. And so Sula comes back with a vengeance. First thing she does is go to her grandmother's house and kind of reads her grandmother for filth, if I'm being honest. Kind of disrespectfully, but... And that's also just the dialogue here. It's so good. It's so natural. And there's even turn phrases that Toni Morrison writes, and you're just like, how did she do that? And so that's a big part of the conversation between Sula and her grandmother as well. And so it's really Sula establishing her dominance in a sense. She's coming back. I'm a whole different woman. I'm living for myself. And you, even though you parade around this house as if you're some queen, you're not. I know what you did. I know that you killed your son. I know all of this, right? And eventually Sula does what is arguably unforgivable, and she has her grandmother committed, or she has her taken away to an old folks home that's not officially an old folks home. It's kind of just a place where people have dumped some old people. So it's not a great situation. No one's really taking care of them or really looking out for them. And I will say about that scene though, I remember in my notes, I was like, even though her last name is Peace, Sula came back after 10 years ready for war with everybody. And so here's the tricky thing. Eventually, this is like a culmination in the book. Eventually, Sula sleeps with Jude, who is Nell's husband. I don't agree with her doing it, but I understood her rationale. So for Sula, her and Nell had always shared everything. They had shared first kisses. They had shared. So for her, it was we are one. Like, what's yours is mine. She didn't think it would hurt her. But Nell walked in on them having sex on the living room floor. And it's all very quite sad for Nell because her husband just says, I'll be back for my things. What? Nell in one fell swoop loses her best friend and her husband. Her husband leaves her for Sula, but Sula doesn't actually want him. So she sends him on his way. He is sad. He leaves town. And then Sula is basically on escapade for like years and years of just sleeping with men when she wants to, sending them back home. Like anybody's man, okay? Anybody could get it. And then sending them back home because she doesn't actually want them. But then that makes all of the women hate her. And they hate her more because it would be different if she wanted them, if she took them. But it's like, you take them, you have sex with them, and then you discard them. And you send them back home and they're all broken. It's a whole to-do. The women hate her. The men are saying she's a witch. It's a whole thing. And the thing is, what's interesting is just how legends and rumors about Sula come to be, just based off how she chooses to live her life for herself. I think that's a bigger messaging about independent women in general. Another thing about Toni Morrison is that you may be reading this book having a light scene, feeling like it's light and right as rain, and then Toni Morrison throws you some deep sorrow. And so there's a character named Tar Baby. And Tar Baby is actually, everyone's pretty sure he's a white man, but he also lives in the boarding house, and he basically is just drinking himself to death. And so there's this one horrible scene where he's in jail and they beat him, and it's just horrible, right? And so for me, it's how you can have such different characters, and all of them, you feel passion, like you feel compassion towards all of them. And I just think that's marvelous storytelling. Also, one of my all-time favorite scenes is just that last conversation between Nell and Sula when Sula is on her deathbed. And whoo, child. When I tell you Sula read Nell for filth. Oh, one of my favorite lines ever written. Nell talks about Sula being lonely because she had only kind of ever loved one man toward the end. But he was her and a man. The moment that he recognized that she was starting to love him and it was leaning towards that, and eventually she would want to keep and control him, he had to go. And so that, you know, karma has its way of doing that to you, teaching you a lot of hard life lessons. And so eventually Sula's sick. We don't really know from what, but she doesn't really have anyone at this point. There's some young man who comes and checks on her every once in a while. But Nell, being the good person that she likes to think she is, right? She goes and she checks on Sula, and she doesn't want to bring it up. She's above it, right? She's not gonna lead with "you slept with my husband," but eventually the conversation goes there about like, why would you do that to me? And Sula's like, baby girl, that was just a man. Like, that ain't me. She's like, but me, why would you do it to me? And about how I felt. And it was like, we always shared everything. I didn't recognize that it was X, Y, and Z. And then Nell is kind of just like, isn't it lonely? Isn't it hard? Or whatever. Because yeah, she was like, you've lived this life and what do you have to show for it? And Sula's like, show what to who? Like, it's mine. I got my mind. That's what I have. And Nell's like, but you're alone. You're lonely. And she was like, yeah, but my loneliness is mine. Your loneliness is someone else's, manufactured by you, manufactured by someone else and given to you. Ain't that something? A secondhand lonely. Whew. One of my all-time favorite lines ever written. But it's this dialogue, this conversation between Nell and Sula that really is a key focal point in the book. Eventually Nell leaves all upset. She's like, Sula will never understand. She'll be the last person to get it. And so she goes to visit Eva, who's still alive by the grace of God. She's now in an actual home for the elderly. And so she goes to visit her, but because Sula has died. And so she goes to visit her, but Eva mistakes Nell for Sula. And it becomes a whole thing. And then Nell ends up running into Shadrach, and he had this encounter with Sula. And so everyone's just like, y'all were the same person. And she's like, what? And it's true, like, she was a watcher, Sula was the doer, but at the same time, at certain points, Sula was the watcher, Nell was the doer. And so it gives this whole complex story about women and friendship and the complexities of life and choosing different paths. And in the end, Nell realizes that all this time she's been lonely since Jude is love. And the person, she thought she was missing Jude, she actually had missed Sula. And so all this time had been wasted when Sula was actually her one true love. Like that friendship that they had carrying it through, that's the person who had always been with her. So she was actually heartbroken about not having her friend Sula. And I think that's just so profound. I remember when my best friend and I were like not speaking, and that is just one of the hardest things either of us have ever had to go through. Forget a breakup or whatever, just losing your friends is just such a deep, deep pain. I think that's because that's who you expect to be there through it all, right? Through those relationships, through the ups and downs of life. So I very much resonated with that. And then also we do get a full circle knowledge of what happens to the town people as well in the bottom. And then there's a very deep story about them going into a cave and this cave not being completely built, because this cave matters throughout the story as far as Black people not having access to work on it and to build. And so they go in and a lot of them die there. And so I think there's a deep messaging there as well. And then eventually what's known as the bottom, which is actually the top up in the hills, everything changes, right? Eventually gentrification happens. The wealthier white folks want to go up, and now they want to live in the hills where they had once sanctioned the Black people off to, because it was the land that wasn't growing crops, right? So everything changes. So we do get this last understanding of the bottom and how everything transpires, and it's so sad, but I appreciate that we get the full story of it and how Black people essentially sacrificed themselves to have what white people had. And just how heartbreaking that is, because they failed to realize that they already had something rich and beautiful in the community and culture that they had created, but they were so busy chasing privilege and access, which is important, by all means, don't get me wrong, but they forgot to hold on to themselves and value what they had built, which was truly a treasure. And those are just some of the big lessons from Sula. Again, one of my all-time favorite books. On my scale of you should read it now, read it when you have time, or read it when you want, obviously always read it now. Read every Toni Morrison book as soon as you can. It's never a debate, it's never up for question. So yeah, I love it. Definitely recommend everyone to check it out. More book reviews will be coming soon. I'm currently reading Kindred so that I can watch the TV series on FX and do a book versus adaptation video for you all. So that will be coming soon. Until the next time, I'm someone who believes that books are sometimes better than people. Please remember to give time, to be kind to each other, and to have the best day of your life on purpose. I will catch y'all in the next one. Peace. Adios. Odabo. Ciao.